Professor Ellen Davis is concerned about degradation of the earth, and she says she knows a source of wisdom for confronting today's environmental challenges, the Bible. She's a contributor to the 2008 publication of The Green Bible, and she is here to take your questions on Christians and creation. To ask Professor Davis a question, send an email to live@duke.edu. You can tweet your question with the tag Duke Live or post it on the Duke University Facebook page. I'm James Todd with Duke's News Office, and Professor Davis, we are here at your online office hours. Let me tell everyone watching just a few things about you. As we mentioned, you contributed to the HarperCollins Green Bible along with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the late Pope John Paul II, and some other really notable theologians and writers. Your most recent book is Scripture, Culture, and Agriculture, an agrarian reading of the Bible. And here at Duke, you are the Amos Reagan Kearns Professor of Bible and Practical Theology at the Divinity School. So in getting into this topic of Christians and creation, let's start with the Green Bible that you helped out with. And we should say it's not a new translation of the Bible, but instead it's an existing translation that has passages marked in green that pertain to this relationship among God, humans, and the land. So I want to hear, when you were approached with this project of the Green Bible, what made you think, yes, the world needs a Green Bible?
Okay, thank you, James. That the world needs a Green Bible is maybe a stronger claim than I'm willing to make, but I thought it could be useful. Useful in two ways. The Bible is aimed at people who take the Bible seriously, but may not take the environmental crisis, the ecological crisis, however you want to put that, seriously. And on the other hand, it's aimed at people who might take the crisis itself very seriously, but not think that the Bible or the church or the synagogue has any light to shed on that. And I think that as an initial way of looking at the Bible, they've, in green soy ink, marked passages that they think
It's environmentally friendly.
Exactly, or in some way draw attention to our relationship with what we would call natural resources, the biblical writers would call the works of God's hands. And I think part of what's striking is just to thumb through and see where the green shows up and how pervasive it is, beginning, well, now I have to look, but I'm assuming beginning in the first chapter of the Bible,
Right, in Genesis.
and going through to the end.
Right.
So
Good. Now, something that you say in your introductory essay is that, and you're an Old Testament scholar of the Hebrew Bible, you say that the Old Testament represents the condition of the land as the single best index of human responsiveness to God. That is, the health of the soil sort of indicates the health of the relationship between man and God. So what is it that persuaded you of that?
about 20 years ago, I was teaching the introductory Old Testament course of Genesis to Chronicles in the course of a year. And I think it was the end of the first semester when I was going to give the final exam. And one of my teaching assistants, preceptors, said, well, you need to ask a question about the land. And I said, why? And he said, because you talk about it all the time. And I wasn't conscious of doing that. I was simply trying to report on what the Bible was talking about, book by book. But once he drew that to my attention, I began to notice that in the Old Testament, it's a bit different in the New, you can't go more than 2 or 3 chapters in almost any book without seeing some reference to the land, water, non-human creation, heaven and earth, different ways of putting that. And I just began to pay attention to what that was saying, the sort of cumulative witness, you might say, of the Bible in that respect.
Okay, good. We already have a question that's come in by email, and everyone watching can ask Professor Davis a question by email, by Twitter, or by Facebook. This question has come in from Ronald in Cleveland, and he asked, to what extent do you see increasingly adverse environmental and human health changes, such as genetic mutations, as continuing consequences of the fall of mankind? He's taking us back to original sin. You wrote that the original sin was an eating violation.
I certainly think that from a biblical perspective, the human presence in the world is potentially for evil or for great good, for great evil or for great good. I don't know that I want to draw a firm line of connection in terms of causality between the first eating violation in Genesis as the Bible represents it and present interferences. I think what I would like to say is that I think that first eating violation in the 3rd chapter of the Bible.
I'm talking about Adam and Eve eating from the fruit of the
Right.
tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
It's an emblematic story.
Okay.
First of all, it says that eating is a religious act. It has something to do with our relationship with God. I think virtually every people in every time in the history of the world, with the exception of people in industrial culture, have viewed eating as a fundamentally religious act. And it's that emblematic story in the 3rd chapter is also saying that there are limits. I mean, even the Garden of Eden is not a place without limits.
Okay.
And there's only one rule, and the humans violate it. And so, again, it's pointing, and this accelerates in the next few chapters of Genesis, to the fact that the human presence of the world can cause suffering, not only for humans, but also for non-human creation. And the outcome of that act is the cursing of the soil on account of you, ba'avorecha, as God says to Adam. And then that filling of the world with evil accelerates until finally in the 6th chapter of the Bible, God decides to do something about it because the earth is filled with violence, as the biblical writer says, on account of humans. Again, I would see this as communicating a message in story form, in imaginative form, that is saying that the human presence in the world can cause irreversible damage in systems. We live in a world that God has made. And again, we can live there for great good, in the image of God, exercising a benevolent dominion on God's behalf, all of this sort of the vision of Genesis 1. Or we can exercise it in a way that the flood story captures with one word, Hamas, violence.
Okay.
So,
and interestingly, it's, I guess, just coincidence that last night former Vice President Al Gore spoke here, and the headlines about his talk read that he's saying climate change is a moral issue. And you wrote something similar in your introduction to the Green Bible. The moral order of the world cannot be neatly separated from its physical order. So in the Bible, where do you see these connections between justice and the land?
okay. Maybe the most important thing to say is that from a biblical perspective, the covenant is not purely a two-way relationship between human beings and God. The covenant is a three-way relationship. Again, thinking about the aftermath of the flood story in Genesis, when God makes a covenant with kol basar, all flesh.
Okay.
So all of the non-human creatures, and when I use the word land, I'm speaking not just about dirt.
Okay.
I'm using land in the sense that Aldo Leopold, who's one of the seminal thinkers of modern ecology, used it. He says land is a fountain of life. It's a fountain of energy connecting all creatures through what we call the food chains. And so soil itself is it's a community of living creatures. They're microbial in large part. But all of these things are living creatures with whom we are in connection. And I think a clear instance of the the violation of that is that in the prophets, for instance, when Israel is out of sync, you might say, with God, then the result is that the land languishes and mourns. Jeremiah, Isaiah, you see this. Interestingly, the word in Hebrew for mourn, avel, also means to dry up.
Okay.
Not surprising, maybe,
Right.
in a part of the world that's semi-arid. But you can already see in that word a kind of crossing over between the moral order and what we would call the purely physical order.
Interesting. We've got another question that's come in, and we now have 100 people participating online in office hours here. And everyone who's watching is invited to ask Professor Davis a question. To do that, send an email to live@duke.edu. You can tweet in your question with the tag Duke Live or post it on the Duke University Facebook page. This one comes from Bonetta, who read your book, Scripture, Culture, and Agriculture, in her book club. And she said she enjoyed it and had a good discussion. So her question is, how may we, who are concerned about caring for the earth, address this serious issue to others in a way that will not provoke political or social biases, but show a genuine concern for future generations for basic welfare? Or is it to those who speak out are going to be stereotyped and criticized as the prophets were in the Old Testament?
It's a great question, and there probably isn't a single right answer to that question. Certainly already some people are speaking out in ways that are bringing suffering upon them. I'm thinking more in other parts of the world,
Okay.
Africa, for instance. But still, I think that could happen in some places in our country, but there are all kinds of levels at which one can carry on this discussion in meaningful ways. I've discovered in my teaching, and I think the people in my classes have a range of political sympathies. We don't all vote the same way in local and national elections. But rather than taking my stand on particular political questions that are coming up right now, what I try to show them is, first of all, what the Bible says about our relationship with the non-human creatures. And then I try to just highlight things that are sort of non-debatable in the news. What can we say about the toxins in our soil and in our water, or our erosion rates? These are things that there isn't any debate about the existence of them. And then simply set them side by side and see what people find. And the cumulative evidence so far in almost 20 years of teaching this, I found to be pretty persuasive to everybody, that there is a problem and that the Bible has something to say about this. And that the problem is not at the base level such a difficult one to understand.
Now, what about passages in the Bible, and it's even marked in green in here, when God gives the mandate to Noah and his sons, be fruitful and multiply, fill the whole earth, that some people in our modern ears might say, oh, that doesn't sound very environmentally conscious.
Yeah.
So what about passages like that?
Okay. The Bible is not a religious tract. It's not a simple statement of the faith. So some of them take more wrestling with than others, and I won't say that I've wrestled them all out to my satisfaction. But about that particular one, I think the most important thing is that when the humans are told, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, and I say exercise skillful mastery over it. It's often translated dominion. The most important thing about that is that humans are not the first to receive the blessing and the command to be fruitful and multiply. It's on the 6th day of creation that humans are given that, but on the preceding day, that same command, be fruitful and multiply, has been given to the creatures of the sky and the creatures of the sea.
Okay.
So from that, I would infer that whatever our exercise of skillful mastery means, and I have some suggestions about that, it cannot be exercised in such a way as to nullify the blessing over the creatures of air and sea. Well, we live in the sixth great age of species extinction, in which, for readers of the Bible, it seems almost pointedly ironic that amongst the creatures that are most targeted for extinction are birds and sea creatures. So I would say we've got a problem.
Okay. We've got another question that's come in, and this one comes by Twitter from Miss Stewart. And she asks, in a world where fewer people have direct experience with agriculture, how do you best preach biblical passages with agrarian references?
Okay. Part of the problem, certainly, in our food system is that so few people in industrial society do have direct experience of or knowledge about agriculture. Less than 1% in our society are involved full-time in growing food. I'm sure that has never been paralleled in the history of the world, and it is part of our problem. But everybody eats.
Right.
And so I think the first thing is to help people connect with the sources of their food. Help them know how their food, what its prehistory is before it got into their grocery bag or onto their plate. I also think helping people learn how to cook is a really important step, just to be conscious of what you are taking into your body. And in this area, at least, and I think in many other regions of the country, there are more and more opportunities to learn about the sources of your food, even if you don't grow any of it. I was in Manhattan a few weeks ago, and I ran into, on my way to the train station, I ran into 2 farmers' markets in Upper Manhattan, going from the apartment where I was staying to the train station. This wasn't the case when I lived in Manhattan 20 years ago.
Right.
In the Triangle, we have multiple farmers' markets. We have farms that invite people to be guests, to see what's going on. We have many grocery stores tell something about where the food comes from. You have opportunities to buy local food, regional food, as well as peppers that were grown in Chile. So all of these are ways that we can learn more about our food system, and also the media.
Right.
It's front page news. It's on CNN. So I think it's important to both look for it in the Bible, but also look for it in the news in our neighborhoods. I would also say that growing even a tiny portion of our own food is possible for most of us. It may be a pot of herbs on your windowsill.
Right.
But in Vancouver, for instance, about 50% of the population grows some portion of its own food.
Interesting.
If they can do it in Vancouver, they can do it in a lot of other places, certainly in Durham.
That's right. You're starting to get into it, but how did you come to study this intersection of God and humans and land? You're a self-described urbanite, so you didn't grow up on a farm. So what was your kind of journey into this area?
I decided to teach a course. Broadly speaking, I framed it as Bible and ecology because I simply didn't know how to narrow it beyond that. And as I began working in that, for several years, I just read quite broadly to sort of see what was out there in the ecological discussion, something that I didn't have any developed understanding of. And I began to see over and over again references to land, to soil degradation, to agricultural practices. And so I was teaching at Yale Divinity School at the time, and I went to the undergraduate library to look in the soil sciences department. I figured if I went to the graduate library, it'd be over my head. But I was just reading the shelves, the spines of the books in the undergraduate library, and there was a title that arrested my attention. And I pulled it off the shelf, thinking, only half-consciously, whoever came up with this title understood how the Bible thinks about land. And the title of the book was Meeting the Expectations of the Land. It was a book of essays by Wes Jackson, Wendell Berry, and Bruce Coleman, edited by them. And that was my first introduction to a very different way of thinking about land that is modern agrarianism. And that it was really like the scales fell from my eyes.
And what was the insight? What was the aha?
The insight was, I'm a Californian.
Okay.
I grew up in a culture in which land is a commodity. It's real estate. It's the most valuable commodity you can have in the San Francisco Bay Area where I grew up. This was a completely different way of thinking about land, not as something that can be bought and sold freely to make a profit, but as something on which life depends.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Can we get another? We got questions coming in, and here's another one. We've got about 200 people participating now in this online office hours, and everyone who's watching can ask Professor Davis a question. To do that, send an email to live@duke.edu. You can tweet in your question with the tag Duke Live, or post it on the Duke University Facebook page. This question comes from Don in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and he's got 4 questions altogether, but they're all around kind of what can the local parish do. He said he's from a United Methodist church, and he's talking about, you know, goals at a parish level or just language that could be in a church bulletin. What's advice for a community, a local community, Christians, putting these things into practice?
Okay. I would suggest that both clergy and laity begin looking at the religious language that they are regularly using and being exposed to. If it's the United Methodist Church, I'm guessing that bread and wine are being blessed on a regular basis there at a communion table. So think about what it means to bless our food. And think about the ways in which we're living that may be a blessing to our land and water that are essential for producing that bread and wine. Again, as I said earlier, I don't think there's anything more powerful than thinking about the way you eat. You know, what it is costing the earth to maintain our way of living on a regular basis. One can also, or a church can also do fancier things, you might say. I know churches that have begun to plant gardens, churches that have begun to host farmers markets. One of the problems with very small organic farmers is that it often costs them a fair amount of money for a season to market at a district farmers market. And since their profit margin is usually pretty small, to spend $500 or $1,000 to have a season's stall can be a lot. So a church, virtually every church has a parking lot. So some churches have chosen to do that. I know a church in the Triangle that decided to hold a service. They're just at the edge of an urban area and a sort of ex-urban area. They decided to hold a service in their area to invite farmers in, mostly older farmers, who are grieving a lifestyle that has been changed. This is a question from Hattiesburg, Mississippi, an area that is changing in terms of rural, urban life. They invited the farmers in to talk about what had been lost in their lifetime. people talked for over 2 hours, just told stories, sang hymns, prayed, and grieved over what had been lost. Some of these people had been quite hostile to the discussion about agrarianism or ecology before. And as they left, their question was, when can we do this again? People are hurting. And I think people are hurting and the land is hurting. One can also do this in the inner city, which are food deserts.
And talk about that, because when I picture a farmer's market, frankly, I picture middle class, upper class, white people that have a little extra money to spend on their food.
Right.
So I mean, you're talking now about urban poor. Where does that fit in?
I think it's important to be aware of both ends of the economic spectrum and in between. There's no question that Americans as a whole spend a smaller percentage of our income on food than any other people in any other part of the world. People who can afford it probably need to begin thinking about spending a higher percentage of their income on food in order to support a healthier way of raising our food. But another thing that needs to happen is making healthy food available in our inner cities, to, as you say, to people who have not much money to spend on food. So one thing that's going on in the Triangle is creating a grocery store in one of the poorer areas of Durham, so that people have good choices for what to eat and are not confined to what they can get at a quick food store, something that has a lot of processed food, a lot of chemicals in it, a lot of fructose in it, things that are going to increase the nutrition. Along with this, I know one church-sponsored garden that is functioning as a community-supported agriculture, in which people pay for their share with sweat equity, not with money. And that is bringing healthy food to people in a neighborhood that, again, was a kind of rural food desert.
Okay, good. We've got another question that's come in here, and everyone who's watching can ask Professor Davis a question. You send it by email to live@duke.edu. You can tweet your question with the tag Duke Live or post it on the Duke University Facebook page. You mentioned earlier Aldo Leopold, the author, and this email question comes from JR, who says, does a biblical approach to creation lead to a praxis that is distinctly Christian with respect to our relation to the land? His follow-up on that is, does this approach differ in substantial ways from a secular environmental approach based on, say, Aldo Leopold's land ethic? And he goes on to quote that, but you're already familiar with it. So yeah, the distinctiveness of a Christian environmentalism, if you will, versus a secular environmentalism.
I think it's not an either-or answer. Certainly, Christians or Jews, because I'm writing for both audiences. I'm basically writing for people for whom the Bible cuts some ice. And Christians and Jews have distinctive ways of speaking, of symbolizing our relationship with what we understand to be the created order. But those ways of speaking and symbolizing and acting out what we believe, those ways, I think, are fully compatible, or at least fully interactive with the ways of someone like Aldo Leopold, who does use scriptural language. I don't know what his own belief would have been, but he's got some exposure to scripture and uses that language. But his basic framework is not a theistic one, at least in anything I have read. But he has, I think, a basic mindset which is compatible with the mindset of the Bible, which is to say it's a non-egocentric, non-anthropocentric orientation toward reality. or insofar as it is anthropocentric, focusing on humankind, it's focusing on humankind as having a special responsibility toward other creatures because we have a special power.
Good. And we've been talking about, as you've been telling your story about how you come to study the environment, it's from the perspective of being a biblical scholar. And part of your role at Duke Divinity School is to train future pastors and to equip them to preach. So Earth Day is coming up. And how should a preacher handle Earth Day? Should it be addressed at all in a sermon? And if so, what's the approach? What's your advice?
I would say in most cases, yes, preachers should address Earth Day. I can imagine that in any given congregation, there could be something that would trump that if there's a especially urgent situation in a congregation. But yes, I think it should be regularly addressed. And I do think that the church has an opportunity at this point to be one of the leaders in our culture for a different way of thinking and living. This kind of goes back to your earlier question. Non-religious groups think the same thing now. It's interesting to hear, I will get to the Earth Day sermon in a minute, but it's interesting to hear Carl Pope, the head of the Sierra Club, a few years ago wrote that there was a time when he would have thought that the church was the last body that could contribute anything of value on this, and now he thinks no change will happen without the church being involved. So I think that there's a greater opportunity for cooperation here, and we need to play our part. I actually looked at the lections for
so what were the
passages
the Episcopal
appointed.
Church. What would the passages
It's actually not the Episcopal
Okay,
Church.
tell us.
It is the Revised Common Lectionary, which is used now. I am an Episcopalian. It is used by many Episcopal churches now as the sort of default choice for preaching, but it's widely used by Protestant denominations and I believe also by Catholic Church. And Earth Day or Earth Sunday this year falls on the 18th of April, so a couple
Sunday
of weeks
before Earth Day.
That's right. And if I were preaching on that Sunday, I would preach on the gospel passage, which is John chapter 21, the first 19 verses. And that passage, both stories in there are about food. The first one is the story of the miraculous catch of fish, that the disciples have been fishing all night and they're not catching anything. Jesus, the risen Christ, comes to them and tells them to let down their nets, and they bring up a catch of food. It's making the point that is made from the first chapter of the Bible on, that God is the source of food. God is the one who gives food. In this case, the human means for providing their own food have been exhausted. Their nets have come up empty. And Jesus comes along and directs them in how to fish, and they come up full. Interestingly, following that, there's another passage, Jesus speaking to Peter, saying, if you love me, I'm paraphrasing, if you love me, feed my sheep. Now, feed my sheep certainly can be taken as a metaphor. I've always taken it as a metaphor. But in light of this previous story about fishing, I'd be inclined on Earth Day to talk about both of those in terms of our understanding of how we eat. Eating is, as I've already suggested, it's the primary ecological act. Eating is the thing that most regularly connects us to the rest of the created order. We have a broken food system. We know that. So, and both nationally and increasingly globally, we have a broken food system. So what would it mean then for the church to take on the task of leading our communities in beginning to rebuild a food system so that we can fulfill Jesus' commandment, feed my sheep, both literally and metaphorically?
And that brings up an issue. Of course, we just celebrated Easter and the resurrection of Jesus. There's also a Christian understanding of at Easter, Jesus initiates a new creation. And so is there a way that Easter speaks to these ecological issues?
That's an interesting question. Yes, I think that what you've just said is the key to the answer, that Easter is the beginning of a new creation. Mm-hmm. It is an opportunity for the disciples to live into the power of the Holy Spirit that is being breathed into them in Jesus' resurrection appearance. It's actually appearing in the Revised Common Lectionary this Sunday. Mm-hmm. It's a new creation story. When Jesus breathes onto the disciples, breathes into them the Spirit in the same way that God breathed into Adam at the creation of the world. Mm-hmm. So what does it mean then to live in the power of of the Spirit of God? Mm-hmm. And part of what we see in probably the Acts of the Apostles is one of the fullest answers mm-hmm. to that. What we see is it means forming new communities. Mm-hmm. It means a new kind of economic order. The disciples pool their resources. Mm-hmm. Most of us are not going to take that step. But I think we shouldn't take lightly the fact that the Spirit is calling the followers of Jesus into a new way of ordering their economic life. Mm-hmm. And certainly food and land are at the base of every society's economies. Mm-hmm. I mean, we think our economy is based on money. Mm-hmm. No economy that thinks it's based on money is a lasting economy. Because if we destroy the basis of our living, then we're out of business. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that this is an opportunity to rethink our lives and identify again what is the base on which God is enabling us to build a life-giving community. And that, I think, is something of the Easter life.
Great. We've got about 300 people participating in online office hours, and we've got another question that's come in. Everyone watching can participate in this conversation. To do that, send an email to live@duke.edu. You can tweet in a question with the tag Duke Live or post one on the Duke University Facebook page. This comes from Joey, who says, could you speak to the practices of industrial agriculture and how it may violate our role as stewards of creation? Second part, do you think it's easier to address this subject in rural churches when congregants have a closer relationship with the land? Community context. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's easy to address this question any place. Mm. Because whether we live in the city, I think we must address it, mm-hmm. but I don't think it's easy. Whether we live in the city or whether we live on the farm or someplace in between, almost all of us, including certainly myself, are implicated in a system that is largely destructive. Mm-hmm. In some ways, it's harder to address it in a rural situation simply because the wounds are so exposed. Mm. I don't know any farmer who isn't in pain over our dominant farming practices in North America and increasingly through the world. Even though a number of them are looking for the exits from that dominant mm-hmm. system, and a number of them are finding some of those exits. And all of our farmers are economically vulnerable, and the closer you get to rural life, the more you feel that pain. So it's not easy. But some of the ways that we all need to be aware that we're in a system that doesn't have a long future. The good news, in a sense, is we will not be farming the way we're farming now 50 years from now.
Why is that?
The bad news is we won't have the resources to do it. Okay. More than 50% of the topsoil in Iowa has been eroded. That's one statistic that is, we happen to have that statistic for Iowa. It's similar in other places. Our erosion rates far outpace replacement rates. They have been brought down to some extent from about 13 times the replacement rate to 9 times, but at the cost of, in most places, very high use of chemicals. So our erosion rates are too high. Our toxic rates of both soil and water are very high. We've got hundreds, maybe thousands of dead zones at the openings to our rivers. That's a result of toxins. We're over-pumping our aquifers. The underground sources of water, agriculture is the highest source of fresh water consumption in our world. We are drastically reducing our seed base because of our dependence upon hybrids, which require high chemical inputs and high irrigation. We've drastically reduced the natural seed base in all of our major crops. And a broad seed base is, of course, it's nature's form of protecting us against famine. Climate changes, you have a drought, this won't grow, but this will grow. But when you reduce your seed base from tens of thousands of species or land races within a given kind of food, like rice or wheat or corn, reduce it from, in most cases, thousands or tens of thousands, to the amount of genetic material that is available in one human couple, which is largely what we have done in each of these major food areas, well then the chance of disaster is very high. This is what happened, of course, with the Irish potato famine. They were growing one kind of potato, and when the blight came, it was disaster.
So these are all some warning signs. I'm interested, you have a relationship with Christians in Sudan, the Rank Theological College there, and what sort of insights you've gained about land use and the agrarian view of the Bible by being in relationship with these Christians, and some of whom are living subsistence lives.
Right. For about the last 6 years, I have been working on building up theological education in southern Sudan. I've been working with my own Anglican communion in the Episcopal Church of Sudan. The most encouraging thing, I suppose, is that everyone in Sudan immediately recognizes this as a problem that the church has to take on. That's because they're an agrarian society. And as my Sudanese students have said to me over the years, we live in the Bible. We understand this way of thinking. So that's given me a sort of point of connection between Iron Age ways of thinking and the contemporary situation. Sudan has endured about 50 years of civil war, about 20 years of genocidal war, as you know. And part of the destruction that came from that war has been of the food system. These are communities, the communities I work with, they're in the Nile Valley. There isn't richer land in the world. But it has been denuded of its tree cover because of the war by both sides, so people wouldn't have any place to hide. Villages have been destroyed with their agriculture. We are now engaged in rebuilding this from the ground up. The church is the primary NGO, non-governmental organization involved in rebuilding southern Sudan. And so the theological colleges are now developing a new way of thinking about theological education. And we call it a holistic model, It includes not only traditional theological subjects like biblical studies,
Right.
but it also includes sustainable agriculture, nutrition, community health. And all of those are taught from a theological perspective. They're also teaching me how to think theologically and how to convey that to my students in North Carolina.
Good. And a quick shout out if someone's interest is piqued and they want to be involved with something like this. What do we Google? What do we look for?
Go on the Duke Divinity School website /programs/initiatives/rank RENK.
Okay, that's the key word. We've got a couple more questions. We're well into this office hour, but there's two more. I'd love to get to those. And this email question comes from Francesca, who says, I think your message of the renewal of the human connection to the earth and responsibility to it is universal. Christianity/Bible is one faith to use an example. Can you identify other faith communities that do this?
Absolutely. I think there's no question it's universal. We are what is aberrant in industrialized society in not getting this connection. I'll just mention two connections quickly. One is Judaism. As I said, I generally write for both Jews and Christians. And Judaism, because it has from the beginning placed stronger emphasis on daily practices such as eating practices.
Kosher, eating kosher.
Yeah, exactly. There's room in Judaism and maybe a little bit more sensitivity to some of these issues. I have found a number of people both in this country and in Israel very receptive to this way of thinking. One other example outside biblical faiths, I was in Indonesia a few years ago, working primarily with the relatively small Christian population in Indonesia. But in one place where I was lecturing, a journalist came to speak to me. And after interviewing me, she said, now I understand what I saw last week at a Buddhist temple. She said farmers were coming from around the area to the temple, and they were mourning what was happening in their agricultural system. Indonesia is also experiencing industrialized agriculture, just as we are in North America, increasingly dominant. And they had come to the temple to bring the first fruits of their soil, you might say, but to also grieve a system that they could see was destructive to their land, to their water, and to their rural communities. And I realized this is exactly what I am seeing in my community in the Triangle in North Carolina.
Good. So this question may stretch you a little bit. It's come in from Emily, and she said, as one who enjoys pets and has spent hard-earned money on kibble and bird seed, I find myself in need of Christian guidance. She describes an epiphany of realizing all of the resources that were going to feed her dog and potentially some harmful consequences of the production of dog food and cleaning up after the dog. She asks, how can our pets help us reflect upon creation and transform our stewardship of the resources and relationships entrusted to us?
It's a really important question. And as someone who has loved and learned from dogs and cats, it's one that I have a lot of sympathy for. First of all, I'll say nothing is pure. And none of us is going to lead a sinless life in ecological terms. I think that our animals can teach us a great deal. I think there's almost a miracle. I think it is a miracle, but it's a sort of daily miracle, so we don't think to notice it and name it as such. The kind of genuine sympathy and love that can be reciprocal, I think, across species between us and at least the cats and the dogs we know best. I haven't experienced it with other species, although I know that it can be so. I think it is a kind of a miracle of our experience of what it might mean when we read in the Bible that God has a covenant with all flesh. And that we can feel love across the species barrier. This, I think, is part of how God is touching our hearts. And maybe by extension, giving us a kind of sympathy for creatures that we will never see, whose existence we can only imagine, but knowing the needs of this creature, however domesticated, however non-natural. But we have an imagination. We can extend ourselves beyond that. They also teach us a kind of humility. They teach us patience. So I think those are gifts that our pets give us.
Good. This has been a great office hours session. I want to wrap up with one last question here. And this is coming off of something that you wrote, that land care itself is a primary religious obligation. We've touched on it at a number of points in the conversation, but to wrap up with, what does that religious obligation look like in the daily life of the Christians who are watching right now?
For many people, it means gardening. And again, I would think it's rather similar to what I'd say about pets. However domesticated it may be, and it may be flowers rather than wheat that we're growing. And yet it gives us a sense of all that God is giving us. Through that, I think anyone who gardens understands that the earth is not an it. It's upon which we act at our will. It's a creature with whom we have an opportunity of a fruitful relationship. That's one possibility.
Good. Great. Well, thank you, Professor Davis, for holding these online office hours. And everyone who is watching that wants to follow Professor Davis's work, you can find out more on the Duke Divinity School website. That is divinity.duke.edu. You can learn more about the Green Bible at greenletterbible.com. A recording of this office hours session, along with many other Duke videos, will be available on the new Duke On Demand website. That's ondemand.duke.edu. To learn more about Duke, visit duke.edu.